Hello dear students, I am Chetan Singadia from Dr. Subhash Technical Campus. You are watching the video lecture series for the subject of Database Management System. Today we are going to see the entity relationship model, that is nothing but ER model in Database Management System. In entity relationship model, in ER model, we are going to discuss list of the topics, that is what is the ER model, the history of ER model, what is actually ER diagrams, the components of ER diagram, relationship of ER diagram, weak entity sets exist in ER diagram, attributes, cardinality, ER notations and steps to create an ER diagram. And the last we are going to see, that is best practices for developing effective ER diagram. So let us start with the entity relationship model, that is nothing but ER model. Now let us discuss what is the ER model or what is entity relationship model. The entity relationship model is a high level conceptual data model diagram. What is that? Entity relationship model is a high level conceptual data model diagram. The ER modeling helps you to analyze the data requirements systematically to produce the well-designed database. In entity relationship model, it represents the real world entities and relationship between them. It is considered a best practices to complete an ER modeling before implementing your database. In ER modeling, it helps you to analyze the data requirements systematically to produce the well-designed database. So, it is considered a best practices to complete ER modeling before implementing your database. So, this is what an ER model. Let me explain once again what is ER modeling. And ER modeling is nothing but a high-level conceptual data modeling. The main important thing of ER model is that it represents the real-world entities and relationship between them. And it is also considered as a best practices to complete ER modeling before implementing your database. So this is what an ER model. Let us see what is the history of ER model. The ER diagrams are a visual tool which is helpful to represent ER model. And that ER model is nothing but entity relationship model. It was proposed by Peter Chen in 1971 to create a uniform convention which can be used for relational database and network. He aimed to use as ER model as conceptual modeling approach. So this is what the history of ER model. Now let me explain what is ER diagram, that is entity relationship diagram. The entity relationship diagram, ERD, displays the relationship of entity set stored in a database. What is that? It displays the relationship of entity set stored in a database. In other words, we can say that ER diagrams helps you to explain the logical structure of the databases. At first look, the ER diagram looks very simple to the flow chart. However, an ER diagram includes many specialized symbols and its meanings makes this model unique. The purpose of ER diagram is to represent the entity framework infrastructure. So this is what an ER diagram. Here you can see in this picture a simple ER diagram is given. It is a simple ER diagram model is given. There are many more symbols need to be represented to complete the ER diagram. Here you can see there are some entities. Here these are the entities and these are the attributes, and each have that entities and attributes. And these lines are represents the relationship amongst them. So this is what a simple ER diagram. Now let us check some of the facts about ER diagram. ER models allows you to draw a database design. What it allows? ER model allows you to draw a database design. It is an easy to use graphical tool for modeling a data, whereas it is widely used in database design. It is a GUI representation of logical structure of the database. Now what is that GUI representation? That is graphical user interface. It also helps you to identify the entities which exist in a system and the relations between those entities. So these are the some of the facts of ER diagram that you have to keep in your mind while creating a ER diagram or ER model. Now, after understanding the definition and history and facts about the ER diagram, the sample diagram, we would like to see why we actually use the ER diagram in database. So here there are some of the reasons for we are using the ER diagram. Let us discuss one by one. It helps you to define the term related to entity relationship modeling. What is that? It helps you to define the terms related to entity relationship modeling. That is nothing but ER modeling. It also provides the preview of how all your tables should connect, what fields are going to be on each table. That means here they are actually explaining that how the tables are going to be connect with the database, and that particular table, what are the fields that it will be exist in that particular table that they are going to discuss. It also helps to describe the entities, attributes and relationships. ER diagrams are translated into relational tables, which allows you to build a database quickly. It can be used by database designers as a blueprint for implementing the data in specific software applications. The database designer gains a better understanding of the information to be contained in a database with the help of ER diagram. That ER diagram is also allowed you to communicate with the logical structure of the database to the user. So these many reasons are there for that we are going to understand the ER diagram for the purpose of database design. Now let us understand what are the components of ER diagram. This model is based on three basic concepts, or we can say three basic components. The first component is entities, attributes and relationship. Let us discuss these three components in detail. Now let us understand this example of ER diagram first. Here there is an example of blue car belongs to student check. So there are three components that we discussed earlier. What are the three components? One is the entity, another one is the attribute, and we have to establish the relations between them. Now what is entity? So entity, we have to provide the entity name. So what could be the entity name? So there is a person, place, object, event or a concept which data is to be maintained. For example, car or student. So that kind of entity name we have to provide to create a ER diagram for a database design. Then what could be the attribute? What could be the attributes names that we can provide while creating a ER diagram? So for example, property or characteristics of an entity. For example, color of a car entity, name of the student entity. So these things we can say Jack. These things we can put it as an attribute while creating a ER diagram. And after specifying the entity and attributes for the ER diagram, we have to establish the relations between them. So that what we can call it as, association between the instance of one or more entity types. So this is short and simple ER diagram which represents the entity, attributes and relationship between them. It also explains the components of ER diagram. There are three main components as we already discussed, that is entity, attribute and relationship. Now let me explain what is entity in ER diagram to create a database design for database design. A real world things, either living or non-living, that is easily recognizable and non-recognizable. So what we have to understand here is a real world thing, either it is a living or non-living, that is easily recognizable. That we can call it as a one type of entity. Another thing that we can include in that, it is anything in the enterprise that is to be represented in our database. It may be a physical thing or simply a fact about the enterprise or an event that happens in the real world. An entity can be place, So here I am going to give the example what kind of entity we can create. An entity can be a place, that is entity name actually, person, object, event or a concept which stores data in the database. The characteristics of entities are must have an attributes and is a unique key. Every entity is made up of some attributes which represents the entity. So friends, this is what the basic concept behind the entities. Let us see some of the examples of entity. Person, in that employee, student and patient. Place, in that store and building. Object, in that we can specify machine, product and car. Event, in that we can represent sale, registration and renewal. Concept, in that we can represent account and course. So these are the simple examples of entity. Now after understanding the entity, what is entity, what are the examples of entity, how we can represent the entity, then after we have to understand the notation of entity. So in that it will include entity set, relationship, weak entities, attributes and cardinalities. So let us discuss one by one in detail. Let us understand what is entity set in ER diagram. Here there is an entity set is given for the example of student. An entity set, what is entity set? An entity set is a group of similar kind of entities. Let me explain once again. Entity set is a group of similar kind of entities. It may contain entities with attribute sharing similar values. Also, entities are represented by their properties, which is also called an attributes. All attributes have their separate values. For example, a student entity may have name, age, class as attribute. So this is what simply you can represent it as an entity set. Now these are the examples of entities. A university may have some departments. All these departments employ various lectures and offer several programs. Some courses may make up each program. Students register in a particular program and enroll in various courses. A lecturer from the specific department takes each course and each lecture teaches a various group of students. So this is how you can understand for the entity set for a particular university example. And you know now what is entity set. Let me explain once again for the entity set. An entity set is nothing but a group of similar kind of entities. It may contain the entities which attribute sharing similar values. And this is how the examples you can describe here. You can see the student entity set example is given, where student and class example is explained here for the university. So this is what entity set. Now let us understand what is relationship. A relationship is nothing but the association among two or more entities. What is that? It is an association between two or more entities. Now we know what is entities. The Tom works in the chemistry department. Here you can see this relationship is represented like this way. Tom works in the chemistry department. Entity take part in the relationship. This entity take part in the relationship. We can often identify the relationship with verbs or verb phrases. For example, you are attending this lecture. I am giving the lecture. Just look the entities. We can classify the relationship according to the relationship types. A student attend a lecture and lecturer is giving a lecture. So these are the simple example. For the purpose of understanding for relationship, we can provide to this particular example. Like here I have explained that Tom works in the chemistry department, and here you can see there are association between two or more entities. So we can call it as a relationship between two or more entities. So this is what relationship. Now let me explain what is weak entities in a ER diagram. A weak entity is a type of entity which does not have its key attribute. This is very important concept in ER diagram, that is weak entities. What is weak entity? A weak entity is a type of entity which does not have its key attribute. Now what does it mean by its key attributes? That means it does not have the prime attributes, or you can say primary key. It can be identified uniquely by considering the primary key of another entity. For that, weak entity set need to have a participation. So here you can see the simple example of weak entity set. There is a weak relationship. So here you can see this decision symbol are represented with two diamonds. So when we have such kind of representation in our ER diagram, so we can call it as a weak entity set. Now in above example, transaction number, here you can see the transaction number is a discriminator with the group of transaction in ATM. So this is what a weak entity by comparing the strong entity set. So this is what weak entities in ER diagram. Now after understanding the weak entity set, so similarly we can also have to explain the strong entity set. So now let me compare these two entity set with parallelly. Now strong entity set versus weak entity set. So what is strong entity set? A strong entity set always has a primary key, where in case of weak entity set, it does not have enough attribute to build a primary key. It is represented by a rectangle symbol, and it is represented by double rectangle symbol. Let me show you once again how we can represent the weak entity set in our previous presentation. Here you can see the weak entity set can be represented by double rectangle. So this is what our weak entity set. In strong entity set, it contains a primary key represented by the underline symbol. In weak entity set, it contains the partial key which is represented by dashed underline symbol. The member of the strong entity set is also called the dominant entity set. The member of the weak entity set is called a subordinate entity set. In strong entity set, the primary key is one of the attribute which helps to identify its member. In weak entity set, it is a combination of primary key and partial key of strong entity set. In strong entity set, in the ER diagram, the relationship between two strong entities is shown by using the diamond symbol. Where in weak entity set, the relationship between one strong and one weak entity set shown by using double diamond symbol. So as we shown in the previous figure. At the last, in the strong entity set, the connecting lines of the strong entity set with a relationship is single. While in case of weak entity set, the line connecting the weak entity set for identifying the relationship is double. So these are the simple comparison of weak entity set versus strong entity set. This is very important as far as understanding purpose. Now let me explain what is attributes. It is the single value property. What is attribute? It is a single value property of either an entity type or a relationship type. For example, a lecture might have attribute time, date, duration, place, etc. Now the attribute is represented by ellipse. So this is how amount, type, and this transaction number. This is how you can represent the attributes in ER diagram. So this is what an attribute. Now we have to understand the types of attributes. There are four types of attributes: simple attributes, composite attributes, derived attributes, multi-valued attributes. There are many more types of attributes. But to understand a simple representation of ER diagram, if you can understand these four, it is easy. Now simple attribute. What is simple attribute? And simple attribute cannot be divided any further. What is simple attribute? A simple attributes cannot be divided any further. For example, a student's contact number is an example of simple attribute. It is also called an atomic value. So this is what an example of simple attribute. Now composite attribute, it is possible to break down a composite attribute. For example, student full name may be further divided into first name, second name, and last name. So this is how you can represent it as a composite attribute. and the third one is a derived attribute. So this type of attribute does not include the physical database. However, their values are derived from other attributes present in the database. For example, age should not be stored directly, but instead of it should be derived from date of birth of the employee. So this is how you can derive age of the employee with the help of date of birth attribute. So this is what the derived attribute. Now multi-valued attribute. A multi-valued attributes can have more than one values. Multi-valued attributes can have more than one values. For example, student can have more than one mobile number and email address. So this is how you can describe or define a multi-value attributes for the ER diagram. So this is what these four types of attributes: simple attributes, composite attributes, derived attributes, and multi-valued attributes. I hope you understand these all four types of attributes. Now let us understand what is cardinality. Now cardinality means it defines the numerical attributes of a relationship between two entities or an entity set. What is cardinality? It defines the numerical attributes of the relationship between two entities or an entity set. This is what two entities and two entity set. There are different types of cardinal relationships are there in ER diagram. For example, one-to-one relationship, one-to-many relationship, many-to-one relationship, and many-to-many relationship. Now let us explain this all the relationship one by one. Now let us understand what is one-to-one relationship. One entity from entity set X can be associated with at most one entity of entity set Y, or a vice versa. Let me explain once again. One entity set of X can be associated with at most means ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा, at most one entity of entity set Y is associated. This is called it as a one-to-one relationship or one-to-one cardinality relationship. For example, one student can register for a numerous courses. However, all those courses have single line back to the one student. So this is what a simple example of one-to-one relationship. Now let us understand what is one-to-many relationship. One entity from entity set X can be associated with multiple entities of entity set Y, but entity from entity set Y can be associated with at least one entity. For example, one class is consisting of multiple students. So this is a one class and it has a multiple student, and this is an example of one-to-many relationship. So this how it can be represented with this is one-to-many relationship. Now let us understand what is many-to-one relationship. More than one entity from entity set X can be associated with at most one entity of entity set Y. However, the entity set from entity set Y may or may not be associated with more than one entity set from the set X. For example, many students belongs to the same class. Many students belongs to the same class. So this is what many-to-one cardinality or many-to-one relationship in ER diagram. Now let us understand what is many-to-many relationship. One entity from X can be associated with more than one entity from Y and vice versa. So this is called it as a many-to-many relationship. For example, a student has a group are associated with multiple faculty members, and the faculty members can be associated with multiple students. So here you can see the multiple students can be associated with one faculty member, and a faculty member can be associated with more than one student. So this is how you can represent it as a many-to-many relationship. By creating this kind of relationship, these symbols, these representations of lines, and these are the most important. So if you are be careful while keeping these straight lines, because it will represent the actual representation of a relationship between whether it is a one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-one, or many-to-many. So this is what a many-to-many relationship of to create a ER diagram. Now let us understand, like to see the ER diagram notations. The ER diagram is a visual representation of data that describe how this data is related to each other. For example, a rectangle is a symbol that represents entity types in ER diagram notation. So this is entity, that you can call it as an entity, which represented as a rectangle. The another one is an ellipse that represents the attribute. Here you can say this is an ellipse that you can represent as an attribute. Then we have a diamond. So here there is a diamond, single diamond, which represents the relationship types. Then lines, the links attributes to entity types and its other relationship types. Primary key, that is which represented as attributes, are underlined. Double ellipse represents the multi-valued attributes, and these double diamonds will represent the weak entity relationship. So these are the basic symbols of ER diagram notations. For example, entity, or we can say strong entity set, weak entity, attribute, multi-valued attribute, relationship, and weak relationship. So these are the notations of ER diagram. This is very much easy. Now after understanding these many things regarding the ER diagram, like definition of ER diagram, ER model, history, what are the symbols that we are using to create the ER diagram. Now we have to understand what are the steps for that, how we can create an ER diagram. So let us see that step. The first step is to identify entity identification, then relationship identification, then cardinality identification, then identify the attributes, and then after we have to create the ER diagram. Let us study them with an example. In a university, a student enrolled in a courses, a student must be assigned at least one or more courses. Each course is taught by a single professor. To maintain the instruction quality, a professor can be deliver only one course. So this is the example. For that we have to create an ER diagram, and for that we have to follow this many steps, like entity. First we have to identify the entity, that is entity identification. Then we have to identify the relationship, that is relationship identification, and that is step 2. Then we have to identify the cardinality, and last we have to identify the attributes. And after identification of this all the 4 steps, then we have to create the ER diagram. So let us start with the step 1. So in university example, first step is that we have to identify the entity identification. So in university we have 3 entities. One is a student, this is the student, course, this is course, and this is professor. So these are the 3 entities that we have identified for the step 1 purpose. In next step we have to identify the relationship. So that is relationship identification. So we have a following 2 relationship, that is a student is assigned a course and professor delivers a course. So these are the 2 relationships that we have to represent in our ER diagram. Now third step is cardinality identification. So for the problem statement, we know that a student can be assigned multiple courses and professor can deliver only one courses. So here you can see the student can be assigned multiple courses. So here there is a student can be assigned a multiple courses and professor can deliver only one course. Professor can deliver only one. So here you can see the symbol that we have put it here, that is a different, and here it is a different. So this is we have to keep in mind while creating a cardinality identification or provide the relationship. Then fourth step that we have to identify, that is attributes. So we need to study the files, forms, reports, data currently maintained by the organization to identify the attributes. You can also conduct the interviews with various stakeholders to identify the entities. Initially, it is important to identify the attributes without mapping them to a particular entity. Once you have the list of attributes, you need to map them to identify the entities. Ensure an attribute is to be paired with the exactly one entity. If you think an attribute should belong to more than one entity, use a modifier to make it unique. Once mapping is done, identify the primary keys. If a unique key is not readily available, then create one. So here you can see these are the list of entities, student, professor and course. These are the primary keys: student ID, employee ID and course ID, and these many attributes: student name, profession name and course name. So this is what the simple identification of attributes for the ER diagram. So after identification of attributes for the ER diagram, we have to represent that attributes in our ER diagram. So we know these are the attributes and this is primary key. These all are the attributes and these all are our primary keys. So this is till now we have created the student is assigned more than one course and professor is deliver only one course. So for the course entity, attributes could be duration, credit, assignment. For sake of ease, we have considered just one attribute in this example. So this is what we have taken, only one attribute for a understanding purpose. So this is what the identification of attributes with the example. Now this is a complete ER diagram for this university example, a more modern representation of ER diagram. A student assigned more courses and professor delivers only one courses. If we are talking about the student entity, then there is a two attributes. One is a student ID, that is primary key, and student name is a attribute. In here course, it should be a primary key should be a course ID and attribute should be a course name. And in professor, it should be, the primary key should be a employee ID and professor name should be a attributes. So this is how we can simply follow these 4 steps and easily create the ER diagram for any example. I hope you understand this ER diagram example. Now let us see what are the best practices for developing an effective ER diagrams. In that first one, we have to eliminate any redundant entities or relationship. So eliminate that means we have to discard that entities or relationship which is not required. You need to make sure that all entities and relationships are properly labeled. So that we have to keep in our mind that all the entities and relationships are properly labeled or proper naming is provided. There may be a various valid approaches to an ER diagram, but you need to make sure that the ER diagram supports all data that you need to store. You should assure that each entity only appears a single time in ER diagram. So this is important one. So while creating a ER diagram, we have to make sure that the entity should be appears a single time in ER diagram. Name every relationship. We have to provide the name to every relationship. Also, we have to provide the name of the entity, name of the attributes which are represented in your ER diagram. Never connects ER diagram to never connects relationship to each other. This is important. While creating a ER diagram, we are not going to connect the relationship to each other. You should use colors to highlight the important portion of the ER diagram. So these are the best practices while creating, while developing an effective ER diagram for a database design. Now let us see the summary till that in this video lecture, what are the topics that we have covered. So in that we have covered the ER model, which is nothing but a high level data model diagram. ER diagram are usual tool which helps to represent the ER model. We also discussed about the entity relationship diagram, which displays the relationship of entity set stored in a database. ER diagram also helps to define the terms related to entity relationship modeling. In ER model, it is based on 3 basic components like entities, attributes and relationship. An entity can be a place, person, object and event, or a concept which stores the data in a database. The relationship is nothing but the association amongst the 2 or more entities. The relationship, that means relationship we have discussed. We have also discussed the weak entity, that is nothing but a type of entity which does not have a key attribute or which does not have a primary key or a prime attributes. We also see in the single value properties of either it is the entity type or relationship type. It helps you to define the numerical attributes of the relationship between 2 entities or entity sets. The ER diagram is a visual representation of data that describes how the data is related to each other. And at the last, while drawing an ER diagram, you need to make sure that all the entities and relations are properly labeled. So in this video lecture, we have discussed the complete scenario of ER diagram from symbols, definition, history, facts, then relationship, cardinality, weak entity set, strong entity set, what are the steps that we have to follow to developing an effective ER diagram. Also we have seen the best practices. These are the few reasons for why we are using the ER diagram. Also we have seen the best practices rules, that few things that we have to keep in our mind while creating a database ER diagram for database design. So this is what ER diagram, friends. Thank you.